In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte launched the most ambitious and disastrous campaign of his military career, the invasion of Russia. With over 600,000 men, he set out to crush the Tsar and bring the Russian Empire to its knees. But what began as a march to glory ended in frost-bitten retreat, mass death, and the slow unraveling of an empire. In this episode of History in Under 15 Minutes, we explore the story of Napoleon's greatest gamble and the brutal Russian campaign that broke him. Prelude to Invasion: The Road to War. By 1812, Napoleon was at the height of his power. He had crushed Austria, Prussia, and other European powers. Only Britain and Russia remained defiant. His continental system, a trade embargo against Britain, required the cooperation of every European nation under his control. But Tsar Alexander I of Russia had grown tired of French dominance and quietly resumed trade with Britain. Napoleon saw this as an open challenge. Determined to enforce his authority and bring Russia to heel, Napoleon assembled the Grand Armée, a massive force of over 600,000 men, drawn from across his empire. French, Poles, Germans, Italians, even reluctant conscripts from occupied territories. In June 1812, they crossed the Niemen River and entered Russian soil. Napoleon expected a swift campaign, a few battles, a march to Moscow, and a Russian surrender. Instead, he entered a vast, empty trap into the Russian wasteland. The Russians had no intention of giving Napoleon a traditional battle. Under commanders like Barclay de Tolly and later Kutuzov, they pursued a policy of strategic retreat, falling back deeper into Russia, drawing Napoleon farther from his supply lines. They burned villages, crops, and entire cities behind them, a brutal scorched earth strategy that left nothing for the French to use. As the Grand Armée advanced, it began to wither. Men died from heat, hunger, and disease. Horses collapsed from exhaustion. Supplies were scarce, and local populations vanished into the forests. By the time Napoleon reached Smolensk in August, he had already lost nearly 100,000 men, and still, the Russians refused to fight a decisive battle. Smolensk burned as the Russians evacuated. Napoleon entered the charred ruins, still believing he could force the Tsar into negotiations. But the silence was deafening. Borodino, the bloody turning point. By early September, the Russians prepared for battle near the village of Borodino, just 70 miles from Moscow. On September 7, 1812, the Grand Armée met the Russian army in one of the bloodiest battles in European history. With nearly 250,000 men involved, the battlefield was a scene of unimaginable horror. French forces attacked heavily fortified positions like the Raevski Redoubt and the Bagrafian Fleches, suffering enormous casualties. Napoleon hesitated to commit his Imperial Guard, the elite reserve that could have crushed the Russian center. Whether due to illness or caution, he held them back. By nightfall, the Russians retreated, but they were not destroyed. Napoleon had won the field, but at the cost of 30,000 French dead or wounded and nearly as many Russians. It was a Pyrrhic victory that left his army deeply weakened on the eve of their greatest challenge. Moscow, a hollow prize. On September 14, 1812, Napoleon finally entered Moscow, the spiritual heart of the Russian Empire. He expected a dramatic end to the campaign, a grand parade through the capital, followed by a formal surrender from Tsar Alexander I. But instead of triumph, he found eerie silence. The city was nearly deserted. Its population had fled. There was no delegation, no negotiations, only empty streets, and the sound of his army's boots echoing through vacant alleys. Then came the fires. That very night, flames erupted across the city. Entire districts were set ablaze. The fires raged for 5 days, consuming homes, churches, granaries, and warehouses. Historians now believe much of the destruction was orchestrated by Russian saboteurs ordered by the governor, Count Rostopchin, who wanted to deny the French even the illusion of victory. Napoleon, stunned, watched helplessly as the capital of a proud empire turned into a sea of ash. His army, exhausted and half-starved, found no shelter, no supplies, and no sense of purpose. Napoleon waited in the Kremlin for over a month, hoping Alexander would sue for peace. But no envoy ever came. The Tsar refused to negotiate with a foreign invader. Autumn began to settle. Food grew scarcer, tempers frayed. The soldiers looted what little remained. Disease spread. What had once been a calculated advance now began to rot from within. Napoleon was trapped, not by armies, but by time, weather, and political silence. With the cold winds of Russian winter blowing into the ruins of Moscow, he made the only decision left to him: retreat. The long retreat. A march into death. On October 19, 1812, the Grand Armée began its fateful retreat. What had once been a powerful, well-organized force had now become a column of survivors, dragging themselves westward through snow and ash. Napoleon hoped to lead his men back along a different route to avoid the devastation of the path they'd already burned on their advance. But Russian forces under General Mikhail Kutuzov closed in. The retreat turned into a nightmare. Kutuzov used a scorched earth policy and constant harassment to weaken the French. Russian Cossacks, light cavalry masters of hit-and-run tactics, tormented the rear guard. Partisans struck at night. Soldiers froze in their sleep. They boiled leather for food, dug frozen horses from the snow to eat, and deserted in droves. Then came the disaster at the Berezina River in late November. Russian forces destroyed the bridges. Napoleon, in one of his few remaining strategic triumphs, ordered engineers to construct makeshift pontoons while under heavy fire. Thousands of French soldiers and civilians tried to cross. Many fell into the freezing water and drowned. Many more were caught in Russian attacks. The army lost nearly 30,000 men in a matter of days. Napoleon himself narrowly escaped. By the time the shattered remnants of the Grand Armée reached safety, fewer than 10,000 combat-ready soldiers remained. The rest were dead, captured, or too broken to fight. Over 500,000 had marched into Russia. Less than a fifth made it out. It was the greatest military catastrophe of Napoleon's career. Consequences: the fall of an empire. Napoleon returned to Paris in disguise and ahead of his defeated army. Determined to maintain control, he spun the catastrophe as a temporary reversal. He moved quickly to raise a new army, calling upon fresh conscripts from across the empire. But the truth could not be hidden. Word of the disaster spread fast, and so did the resolve of his enemies. The Russian campaign had shattered the myth of Napoleon's invincibility. Prussia, seeing an opportunity, declared war and mobilized. Austria, once an ally under pressure, switched sides. Britain increased its support for the coalition forces. Napoleon's diplomatic web unraveled, and with it, his European dominance. Within 2 years, the French emperor was forced into a new series of wars, the War of the Sixth Coalition. And after a string of defeats, Napoleon was compelled to abdicate in 1814. He was sent into exile on the island of Elba, leaving behind an empire in collapse and a continent in flames. Yet even in defeat, Napoleon remained a symbol of revolutionary brilliance and of how unchecked ambition could devour even the greatest of leaders. Legacy: the graveyard of empires. Napoleon's Russian campaign was more than a military failure. it became a symbol of imperial overreach. The lesson was clear. Russia's size, climate, and resilience made it a graveyard for invading armies. Napoleon had not been defeated in a classic battle. Instead, he was undone by a war of attrition, by the refusal of a nation to play by his rules. Future generals would study the 1812 invasion in detail. Some would learn from it. Others would ignore its brutal lessons. In 1941, Adolf Hitler would make the same mistake, sending millions of German troops into Russia during Operation Barbarossa, only to meet a similar fate in the snow-covered ruins of Stalingrad. The Russian winter, the scorched earth, the vast empty plains, these elements formed more than a tactical barrier. They became legends, part of the geopolitical and cultural DNA of Europe. For France, the loss marked the beginning of the end. For Russia, it was a source of national pride. For the world, it was a timeless warning. The higher you rise, the further you can fall. Cliffhanger: the empire strikes again. But even after this catastrophic failure, Napoleon would not disappear quietly. He spent less than a year on Elba before returning to France in a bold gamble known as the 100 Days. The world watched in shock as he reclaimed power and marched once again at the head of a new army. In Part 2, we will follow his final battles: the War of the Sixth Coalition, the Battle of Leipzig, and the final act at Waterloo. How do you stop a man who refuses to surrender, even when the world turns against him? Subscribe and stay with us as we uncover the epic final chapter in the life of the man who once ruled Europe with fire and steel.